Life is not simplistic at all. And the same as nutrition and health, when we talk about things like sustainability, it's also not simple. You can't just say, I'm sustainable, I don't do deforestation and then claim you're sustainable. There's a lot more to it. So that's one thing in common, so I hope you learn a little bit from my talk as well. So I think with many things, quality is something that's an intrinsic value. It's something that's built on trust in what you can see, but also trust in what you can't see, and palm oil is just the same as that. There's every ton of palm oil we produce has an imprint of where it came from, how we made it, the people that were involved in producing it, and their values as well. So when we talk about sustainability, or at least food security, I think there's probably 5 really key components to it, apart from just being able to make enough food and get it to the people that need it. And it involves things like eliminating deforestation. There's no point we produce enough food for the world if we have no environment left. And therefore, a part of that is about increasing yield to meet the world's growing population. We're going to need a lot more food in the coming years, but we don't have really any more land that we can use for it. And we have to do it in a way that doesn't just protect the environment we have today, but what about the environment in the future? Hence things like reducing emissions. And then, of course, we have to improve livelihoods of the people within and around where we produce food. Much of the world, the food is actually produced somewhere else and brought to a different place, particularly those ingredients like oils and fats. And the last thing, of course, it has to be safe to consume. Food safety is an important part. So these are really the important components that I would say is about food security over and above just producing enough food. So I'm going to talk about elements of this and how it relates to palm oil. So my name's David. I work at a company called SD Guthrie. We're headquartered in Malaysia, but we have operations also in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Indonesia, for our upstream and for downstream all over the world where our markets are. So we have about 700,000 hectares of land, about 600,000 is planted, and that's divided up into about 200 plus estates. One estate is normally about 2,000 hectares, and we have a mill that processes the crop from those estates, around about between 3 and 5 estates per mill, so about 10,000 hectares for a mill, and they go to refineries. The refineries tend to be where the product destination is, so we have a refinery in Europe, in the UK, and South Africa, and of course in Asia. So this is kind of the value chain that you can see of the palm oil industry behind me. Sustainability has always been important to us, but it's really a long journey of continuous improvement. We improve as we learn more, and sometimes we improve when the spotlight gets shone on us in a certain area, and then we learn faster. So sometimes that improvement that you might see is a reactive one, where we didn't know that was an issue, or we didn't know how important it was, and now we do. We've been around for 200 years, so there's a lot humans have learned in the last 200 years. And then there's the more proactive side, and we want to try to be more proactive and think about what does the world need in 2030, 2040, 2050? What does the world need in 2100, for example? How do we make sure what we're doing today is sustainable truly for the long term? So this is the thing I think that probably keeps me in the industry. I'm a New Zealander. We don't have palm oil in New Zealand. In fact, we're probably one of the more outwardly against palm oil countries in the world. So what keeps me here? Well, I actually truly believe palm oil is something that's really essential for the world. It's really a critical ingredient. When you think about the growing demand for food, oil and fats is a big part of that, not just because of more population, but changing demographic and diets. The amount of land required to produce a ton of palm oil is 4, 5, 6, 8 times less than it would take from the other oil crops that are available to us. So if we were to meet that growing demand with something else, where's that land going to come from? And if you really dig down to the numbers and look at things like fermented, lab-grown palm oil, they just don't stack it when it comes to scale, probably not for a long time yet. So we really do need palm oil. But it's got to be sustainable. Only about 20% of the palm oil produced in the world is actually certified sustainable, and I'll go into what that means in a minute. We're 100% certified sustainable through a number of different regulatory bodies. Probably the biggest and most popular is RSPO. That's a round table of sustainable palm oil. It's a global association which has a number of different measures that would declare something, palm oil, as being sustainable, and that's chaired by consumers or large FMCGs as well as producers as well to kind of set those standards. What does it really mean? Well, of course, no deforestation is the first part. You can't have deforestation within your supply chain. No peat means that we will not do any new planting on peat. And if we have plantations that are on peat soil at the moment, they have to be managed in such a way that they don't release a lot of CO2. No exploitation, so that's obviously the workers in our plantations. One thing about palm, especially in Malaysia, most of the labor, and I'll show you in a minute, involved in working the plantations is immigrant labor. And so that provides all sorts of issues, and as I said, I'll give you an example of that. But you also have to develop the communities around you. You have to give back to the communities. And I think if you've ever flown into Malaysia, one thing people always say is, as the airplane was coming to land, I could just see palm oil plantations everywhere. It's terrible. That's the kind of thing that you hear. I'm not sure how that's different than certain parts of the US or other countries in the world, but anyway, one thing you will notice if you look a little bit careful, you might see a palm oil mill, and you see a whole town around that palm oil mill with schools, with hospitals, with education, and cities that actually would never have been there 50 years ago had it not been for this kind of development. Again, that comes back to what is sustainability about? If you wiped out all the palm, what would happen? It's the whole community involved for the whole world, actually. And transparency, I think that's the base key of all of this. You can say, well, I can say I'm sustainable, but unless I'm transparent with you and I can show traceability and you can really look into what I'm doing, there's really no proof of that. And I think it comes back to what I said at the beginning. Quality and sustainability is something that's intrinsic, that's built on trust. I mentioned about emissions before. For us, we now have a target of net zero by 2050, and we've already broken that down into a lot of detail about where emissions come from in our plantations. You'll see a couple of bars, or segments if you like, one near the top, land use change. For the industry, that's a much bigger chunk for us because we don't have any deforestation in our supply chain now. That land use change actually comes from when you take an old field and you cut it down and replant new palms, there's some CO2 that's released. The other big green one on the bottom left there is about effluent treatment from our mills. That's a big chunk still for us, but we're working on this. In the industry, it's an even bigger one. But the biggest one we have is actually that orange one, which is us buying crude palm oil or other refined oils and putting it into our supply chain. So those are obviously people that we need to work with in the future. So we have a lot to do. We've actually broken it down into all of those components of what we need to work on over the next 30 years. And we have to have external people come along and check that what we're talking about is real, because we have no intention on making statements and then disappearing. We actually expect to be held accountable for it. We've been around for 200 years. We hope to be around for another 200. So yeah, emissions is part of it. Rehabilitating the land that we do have. As I said, we have 600,000 hectares planted, 100,000 is not planted. So we're rehabilitating these lands. And any of the land that we have planted, which is not that productive, we're also taking that and replanting it. In fact, we used to have quite a sizable rubber plantation. Rubber is not economically viable anymore, so we're actually turning a large part of that into jungle area again. I mentioned about workers' well-being. This is an area example where actually the spotlight was shone on us. A couple of years ago, we actually received an import ban from the US because of questions over exploitation in our supply chain. At the time, we were actually really shocked. We were really surprised. We thought we had good practices in place. But we're a big company, 600,000 hectares, many different estates and workers. So we really had to go down and find out actually what is this about. And it's an area where we learned a lot about workers' conditions, about the recruitment process, all the way from a village somewhere really far out in Indonesia. Actually, what happens to that person from when they leave the village to a recruitment firm, and then they get sent to Malaysia and come to our plantation? Have they had to pay anything along the way to get to us? And the rule is that they shouldn't have to pay anything. They should be covered by us. So being in charge of that whole recruitment process. In a big operation, you can't guarantee that all of your managers treat people well all the time. So making sure you have grievance channels, social dialogue, so you understand these issues in languages that they speak, which is unlikely to be the language in your country. There's a lot to it. As I said before, you often think it's simple. Treat your people well. But the reality is, on the ground, it takes a lot of effort. So these are things that have, as I said, are part of that continuous improvement. Now, I mentioned about deforestation or no deforestation and the need for more food? Well, yield is the basis of this, and this is an area where we were more proactive. In 2009, we started looking at genomics and genetics of palm. How can we improve yield? We started in 2009. By 2016, we had tools and technologies to help us produce and plant better palms. And the yield really is very impressive, 10 to 30% more than our previous varieties. And one reason is if you look at corn, corn goes through a breeding cycle every 6 months. Palm takes 20 years. So in the commercial planting of palm, we've been through 4 generations of breeding. So I think tools like genetics really help us to make a big jump. So we're now replacing our old plantations with palms that are much higher yielding. That's one part of it. You can have palms that produce yield, but how do you harvest it? Now I think these 2 photos show a great story. The one on the left is taken somewhere around 1960. The one on the right was taken sometime last year. Nothing has changed. There's still, in that case, I think maybe an Indian guy holding a long pole cutting a bunch. And on the other side, we have an Indonesian cutting a bunch the same way. For many years, we thought, okay, labor's going to be an issue in future. People are going to be developing, need more pay. We won't be able to afford to have workers come to Malaysia anymore. 10 years by now, we're going to have to solve this issue. And if you ask me a year later, I'd say 10 years away, we're going to have a problem with labor. Ask me the next year, I'd say 10 years away. Well, COVID came along, closed the borders, and suddenly everyone realized, oh, that's now. And I think we realized that you can't continue the way that you always have. Things are going to change, and you have to improve. You can't have plantations like this anymore. These guys burn the equivalent of a marathon in calories every day. It's a tough life. In Malaysia, there's almost no workers that are Malaysian, because in Malaysia, they've got other options. They won't do this kind of work. So there'll be a point that the Indonesians won't want to do it. Then there'll be the point that the Bangladeshis don't want to do it. And this is just not sustainable for the long term. So I do have a short video. We still have a bit of time. Just to show you what we've done in the last couple of years. And I think this will also give you a bit of an insight to what plantations look like, because I'm sure not many of you have seen an oil palm plantation. So here's a short video. So within our R&D team, we've decided that we really need to look to the future and start seeing what kind of machines need to be in place to mechanize and automate our plantations later. All these jobs 3 years ago, manually. I think the point is that it takes a lot of investment. You need to spur the science in this, get young people involved. No, you would have never heard of a plantation company employing robotics engineers, for example, a few years ago, and now this is where we're taking it. The last part I want to talk about for the next 5 minutes is about quality, actually. No point having the rest of it if the food is not safe. And one particular, I guess, concern around oils and fats, especially at the moment, is mosh moa. So I'm going to talk about those now. Mosh moa is mineral oil saturated hydrocarbons and mineral oil aromatic hydrocarbons, basically lubricant, oil, grease, contaminants in food. It's actually getting a lot more attention lately as people can analyze it, basically. But there is a lot of oil and grease in our oil that we consume. So this is something which sort of came up in the scientific literature, and then big companies who are very forward-thinking, like Nestle, pick it up. And then this is something that they realize that they've got to take a lead in, a little bit like sustainability before, what I was talking about. You have to take a lead in it. So we actually got our scientists to go to the ground and find out where are these contaminants coming from, all the way from the estate to the mills to the refinery. And as I mentioned before, this makes it look like a very linear process. The reality is you've got 10 estates feeding one mill feeding, or rather, maybe 20, 30 mills feeding one refinery. So it's not all that simple. But we found some contamination happening in the estates. A lot of it happens in the mill, actually, which is no surprise. If you look at primary food processing around the world, there's often a question of when does it become food? Obviously, the final part of food preparation and packaging, we know that's food. But if you go to some of the primary processing of some of the fruits and vegetables and ingredients in our food, you might think this doesn't really look like food. Well, palm is different. Palm is no different, I should say. But it's something that really needs to be looked at. So identifying all of those sources, doing a lot of analysis. And I'll go through some of them. So here's a mill. This is obviously the most critical part. The bunches, and you can see a bunch there. It has about 3,000 fruitlets in it. The fruitlet you can see at the top as well. They get cooked, basically. We call it sterilization. Then it gets threshed through a drum to separate the fruit, pressed, screened. It's a wet process, so there's basically an oil-water partition that takes place, and you take the oil part out of it. But there's a lot of restreaming of water and things. Even the water that's used to cook gets restreamed back into the process. And to put mosh moa into perspective, the kind of limits we're talking about now is around 1 ppm of contamination is considered acceptable. Okay, 1 part per million. That's about a 4-litre container of oil or a 1-gallon container of lubricant in a 2,500 ton tank of oil, which comes from about 13,000 tons of fruit. So it's really not very much at all. But if I was to take 1 ppm, it's about 1 drop in a 50-litre bucket. If I put 1 drop of oil in a 50-litre bucket and said, would you like to feed this to your child? You would say, no, thank you. So actually, the numbers are kind of relevant in the sense that you can imagine it, where it's coming from. So we had to tie down this whole process and eliminate leaks. And what we realized very quickly, it's about culture. It's about culture of the people working in your plantation. If you go to a Ferrari workshop, I guarantee you won't see a single drop of oil on the floor. It's very clean. And if there's a drop of oil on the floor, it would be cleaned up immediately. But if you go to some workshop in the middle of nowhere, you probably have to slip on the floor. But that's the same thing in food processing. You have to have a clean floor. It's a different culture. It's a different culture that was probably not there before. Here's a couple of examples. The mills which we have may be designed around 1960 out of convenience. You can see on the top left there, it's a conveyor actually, so there's fruit in that conveyor, and on top of the conveyor is a motor with a gearbox. If that gearbox leaks, where's the oil going to drip? It's going to drip inside onto the fruit. So we had to do those kinds of things in engineering control, where you take that motor and you shift it to the side. And now you can see some of the leaks. You can see the blue color there, that's from a UV light. Fortunately, lubricant tends to fluoresce under UV light, so that makes it a little bit easier to see. But you can see you've got to put drip trays in place, and once you've got a clean floor, then you can see when there is a leak. If the floor's not clean, you can't even see if there's a leak. So we had to go through all of these critical control points, change our mills, and all this happened during COVID, actually, in the last few years, to really change things up. But it does go further back than that to the estates. This is fruit actually waiting to be processed at the mill on the ground. Now it's in bins like this, because if you think about it, you've got tractors and trucks driving on the ground, and then you can see a puddle of oil there. Then you put the fruit on top of it, Again, we are talking 1 gallon of oil for 13,000 tons of fruit is enough to put us over the limit. So it required a completely different attention to quality across the whole value chain. Well, the impact, I think you can see 2020 versus 2022. There was a big impact on marshmallow contamination in our supply chain. And it's not trivial. A lot of this is coming from Papua New Guinea, and the oil goes to Europe. In Papua New Guinea, we have 12 mills. All that oil gets commingled into a big tank. And then that tank of oil goes into a ship, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 tons at a time. And it sails for 6 weeks to Europe. So firstly, you have to test it. And if one mill contains high marshmallow, what are you going to do with it? There's nowhere else to send it. So every single mill has to be good. You can't say, okay, this mill is for Nestle, because only Nestle care about marshmallow. Only Nestle is willing to pay us for having low marshmallow. Don't worry about the other 11 mills. You can't do that. It has to be good for everything, and I think that comes back to values. So we have managed to make a big impact, but it requires a complete change in the business. But there's a lot of things still challenging here. Analysis of marshmallow is not easy. Analysis of a hydrocarbon inside a hydrocarbon at 1 ppm is challenging. It's expensive. As I said, in Papua New Guinea, you can't send it to a lab in Europe because it takes 4 weeks for the sample to get to Europe. Meanwhile, the ship has already arrived in the Netherlands, and what are you going to do with it then if it's high marshmallow? So a lot more work needs to be done on fast analysis, making it cheaper so that you can analyze many more samples, and basically get that through to products. Ultimately, it's actually about engagement. Having scientists working with mill managers, working with estate managers, working with our customers. This is, as I said, it's a continuous improvement thing that we have to do, and we have to do that through getting everybody in the supply chain. I gave the example before of putting a drop of oil into a bucket of water. That's the same thing that we had to tell our mill managers. It's not about imposing a limit on them and saying, here's a scientist coming along telling you what you should and shouldn't do. We had to show them and say to them, if there was 1 drop of oil in this water, would you give it to your kid? So that the mill manager now believes in this is something that has to be fixed. So that's it from me. As I said, very different from this morning, earlier today. No science really. But this is about the application of science and where the science meets the road of actually trying to make an impact. Thanks.